Well, I am a melancholic person, and I discovered my DNA is, to my great shock, is Ashkenazi, which I had no idea. Because my mother died when I was 4, and I knew very, very little about my mother. And discovered that her grandparents moved to Dublin in 1834. They played around all the theatres called Johannesheim, as a musical family. I knew nothing about my mother for some reason. I wasn't taught her. I was the youngest son. I discovered all this stuff, and I suddenly thought, well, that would explain why when I heard Django or Beethoven, I felt I knew this music when I was a child. I thought I already know when I heard the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven first. I was completely blown away, but I thought, hang on, I actually know this music. I felt an affinity with what I was listening to. I've always, from a very young boy, listened to the radio like most people my age in the 50s. And I've always liked the sound of a guitar, whether it was classical guitar or jazz guitar. For some reason, I always felt attracted to the guitar. And then I studied fine arts. I went to art school up in Liverpool. And there was a big music thing going on in the early 60s. Before that, the Beat generation that were into bebop music and all, they're into classical. So my roots were there, and when I went to art school, I was already started playing guitar. I met somebody at art school who was a very, very good Django Reinhardt type guitarist. Well, I immediately liked the sound of Django and his ideas. I started playing. During the breaks, we'd go down to this big room between the loo and the corridor at this great acoustic. In fact, it's the same one that John Lennon, all those used. I used to sit down there playing, and I just got more and more involved in the music side. And someone asked me would I join a band that were actually quite well known at that time. A kind of pop, rhythm and blues type of band. So we toured all over Germany. I'd never been to Germany before. When they said we're going to play in Munich, so what? It is completely foreign. I was spring in Schwabing. But in Munich, I met other musicians. I met some classical and jazz guitarists. And I learned a lot just by being on the road. And we were playing in a club next to a place called the PN Hit House. And Steve Linwood was in there with Spencer Davis Group. Anyway, we were invited back to this house. I found myself jamming with Stevie Winwood, who I always thought out of the pop ones, he was one of the best, playing Hammond organ. And I played a bit of keyboard. He said, you play the top, I'll play the pedals. And we're sitting there next to each other. He's in this kipper tie and a suit. I go, I can't believe I'm doing it. This is good fun. So then the next day, of course, you'd be invited to another chap who was a brilliant classical player. Studied with Carl, I'm always embarrassed to say, it's called Carl Scheidt. I always want to say sheet or something. I was already listening to lots of Segovia those days, and John Williams, the first Fernando Saw recordings. I kind of used that band, even though I was bored with the music we were playing between you and I. A lot of it was two little triads, 4 and 1. I kind of used it as a ticket to move about, which was what I did. And went back to London. I met Stanley Myers, who wrote the Dear Hunter. We lived in the same house together for 2 years. So I basically learned most of my stuff on the road and listening. I used to be a serial reader when I was 18, 19, 20. Read The Idiot, Brothers of Karamazov and all that. Yes, everybody did that. Half of it may have been being a bit pretentious, There's something happening in the early 60s. And it could have been the leftover, but mainly because a lot of my heroes were writers. There was Kafka, Orwell, and you know, all those kind of people. And nowadays, that seems to disappear. Now it's about celebrities rather than brilliant people. I was obsessed by Lao Tzu and all those very simple things like, if you care about what other people think, you're forever their prisoner. I read all that stuff as an art student, these very short poems. The titles of some of those Chinese pieces are so beautiful, just very simple. All the Impressionists and all those painters, Cézanne and Matisse, they were all obsessed by Chinese and Japanese prints, you know, those beautiful prints. As an art student, my influences were people like Soutine, who lived with Modigliani, who's a brilliant painter, but more to do with the texture and surface of the paint. Some of the old masters I love, Velázquez or Rembrandt, when you look at the surfaces of these paintings, they're absolutely beautiful. And also it relates to some modern abstract expressionism. You get the same thing. And equally, I like Kandinsky, you know, the modern ones, because for me that's like looking at music. I can hear music when I see a Kandinsky painting, the movement and everything. I basically try to compose how I paint and paint like I would compose. I was very, very nervous and shy. And we had to open up the place called the Savile Theatre near Leicester Square. We had to open up for Jimi Hendrix. I was hired, you know, because I was a session poser, by a group called the Chiffons. The Chiffons were the ones that sued George Harrison because of My Sweet Lord. But this, so we were the opening act, and Procol Harum were on, Denny Lane was on, and I had an old Vox C30 amp, which I had to put in front of his 4 massive Marshall speakers. And I was very embarrassed. I think, so I put it on the chair, and it wasn't the black AC30s. It looked like a sofa covering, and Jimi Hendrix was standing at the side of the stage because he'd never talked, he'd never spoke, apparently. And he was staring at my amp. And I was feeling rather uncomfortable with it. And he went, "Is that your amp, man?" I said, "No." And I said to the road manager, called Wally, it was called, from Southport, I said, "Ollie, have you seen my amp?" with a big wink. And he goes, "It's there, you pillock." Anyway, Jimi Hendrix went, "Nice amp," and just walked off. Now, the idea is about the size doesn't really matter, even in music, I think. It's one of the lessons I learned from Jimi Hendrix, because he loved that little old valve amp. And that's possibly why I'm sort of writing these micro pieces, because you get the same power. And if you look at small paintings, miniatures, they can be so powerful. Stanley would advise me when writing melodies, he said, just avoid too much chromaticism unless it's organic, okay? He'd say something like that, and I think about that, and I think, I know exactly what he means. And I also read lots of books, even the basic books, the Schoenberg, Structural Functions of Harmony. So I started really studying harmony mainly. And the tunes, for some reason, they come out naturally. When I'm not thinking about tunes, the best melodic parts happen. I only had one lesson with John Dwart, and I went over to his place. And I asked him about composing, and he said, "We can't really teach composing." This is from him. I don't think he didn't have any formal training, but nobody talks about it. But what I have done, I've met some really brilliant Russian musicians who give me lots of guidance and helped. There's a guy called Alexander Tchaikovsky, believe it or not. And he helped a lot when I was writing about just balance and stuff when you're writing for orchestra. Obviously, guitar, again, is a completely different way. There's no way he could teach me how to write a guitar piece. It wouldn't work for me. My process is less and less like this now. I have to be inspired by poetry or whatever, get some kind of feeling of a structure. And then I'd imagine that I was in the auditorium hearing a piece of my music for the first time. Existential, or whatever you call it, to be more objective about listening to my own music. So I try to levitate, if you like. I think the worst of my music is when I don't do them. I become too subjectively creative. So it doesn't mean I'm devoid of emotion when I'm writing. It's quite the opposite. It's intuitive, my writing. But I start to think like an embryo, and one idea that repeats, it does come back, leaving huge spaces. Writing for guitar is a completely different method to writing for orchestras. An orchestra is very much more to do with rules, and you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do it, and making all the parts work in beautiful transitions. In guitar, I think in a completely different way. I think more linear on the guitar. I think most of my writings become more like a Matisse drawing, like a beautiful line. Gerald Garcia said, you know, Bill, some of the stuff you write on the guitar, it wouldn't work on any other instrument. And that's because I'm always trying to get the best sounds I can. I think the soft and open string it's got a beautiful effect on the guitar. Basically because of the size of the guitar, I would never dream of putting third intervals in the bass. It sounds like mud to me. Even on the great guitars, that's muddy. So I try and thinning down chords. Like in painting, I stare at the empty canvas for days sometimes. I still write everything out by hand and then have people print. I think in the same way as I would think about a painting. So it's not totally preconceived, and it's not like walking the dog. Oh, we go down here, you know. Because I know the pitfalls and dangers of that. You end up going, you can't get out. You go into a cul-de-sac and you're finished. This scrap the whole lot. It was like going backwards with the Sudoku. You know, one wrong number. And I've only ever succeeded once in correcting that. I try not to fall into that and not to fall in love with your first idea. That happens. Don't even think about composing for days until that goes. Before you even start, you're finished. So I try, I'm just a bit more careful now, I suppose. It has bothered me in the past because I wrote a piece years ago for a brilliant guitarist called Laurie Randolph. She was one of the reasons I wrote my first piece. She heard me playing, said, oh, what's that? And I said it was a piece I was writing. And she asked me to write a piece. So I wrote London Rhapsody, which I thought, in retrospect, is probably about 4 minutes too long. But during that time, this is in the 80s, and one's got to remember I was also on Top of the Pops at the same time, doing this almost completely divided two people, you know. One was grip and grim at the record companies, the other was Please Accept Me in the classical world. Performed it at the Wigmore Hall. And at that time, there wasn't, when I think about it, there was no music like that. I suppose the nearest it was Jorge Morel. And you had, obviously, the Brazilian guys like Baden Powell and all those guys. So it wasn't really accepted. But nowadays, of course, it's completely normal, this kind of music now. It's got through that academic barrier, if you see what I mean. I think I might probably feel the same way. I think he was this reggae singer doing my music. Maybe I'd be the same, so it doesn't really bother me that much. Well, there was a friend of mine called Sasha Abercorn, who was a great, great friend. She was Duchess of Abercorn, and she was a great, great friend of Prince Philip. And also she's Pushkin's great, 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 great granddaughter. Anyway, Sasha, she said, would you like to come to this art gallery, Bond Street or somewhere, there's Prince Philip's coming, and maybe get one of your pieces for string quartet played. Because I wrote a piece called Koi Carp. You know, we put it as part of the evening, so it was about painting. Ted Hughes was they read his very famous salmon poem, which started the whole arts for nature thing off, which is to make people environmentally aware through the arts. Anyway, he heard my piece of string quartet in typical Prince Philip manner. He said, sounds like they're snoozing. It's a very slow bit. He then asked, Sashi said he'd love Psalm 104 set to music, because he liked my music. I asked Sasha, during the process of writing this piece, I said, do you know what Prince Philip's, what music he likes? Because this is going to be for his birthday gala. She was a regular guest in the Royal. He likes Errol Garner, so the jazz pianist. Yes. And Mahalia Jackson. So what, the gospel singer? Yes. So I just thought, okay, that helps, you know. It went down well. He said he wanted it recorded, so we had the London Philharmonic Choir, 80 singers for the original, St. John Smith Square Strings, a soprano called Maureen Braithwaite, who was absolutely brilliant, sounds like Jessie Norman, and a flautist, so that was the original format. And it went down very well. A week later, he said to Sasha, I'd like this performed at my funeral. It ended up going into St. George's Chapel. I had a call from the choir master saying, would you mind if we used your piece as an anthem? So they did the opening part, which is about 3.5, 4 minutes. And he said he wanted to include it at his funeral. So I didn't really take much notice. I thought, wow, it's amazing. Because they planned way ahead. It's in 1995. And I met him several times after. And I thought it was always good fun. A very erudite person, first conservationist in this country, when people thought you were cranky. And I had a call from St. George's Chapel urging, could you call us immediately? And James Vivian was the head of music. And I think James Vivian thought it was his idea, but actually I discovered 20 years before. Anyway, I got the message, say yes, going to happen. And I thought the fact there were only 4 singers worried me until I heard those 4 singers who were absolutely brilliant. It just sounded a lot better because all the lines came out much clearer. Our whole service, I thought, was incredible. It reminded me of El Greco, and I was very moved, obviously. I've always found it difficult to talk about my music. The reason I write music is because I'm not very good with words. It's about communication. All about communication. Also, it keeps you alive when you're gone because you leave a mark on the world, you know, hopefully a good one. I think the best one can do is to at least leave something behind, you know. The best we can get to being immortal, really. Nobody's immortal. At least maybe some of the pieces we write or do will be.